tiny state of Israel, with its nearly indefensible borders surrounded by vast hordes of enemies bent on its destruction, is notable for producing great men of war. And certainly Yitzhak Rabin was one of these, having brilliantly served the arms of Israel from its prehistory as a Jewish Defense Forces commando to Chief of Staff of the country's armed forces during the stunning victory of the Six-Day War. But this warrior, on his way to martyrdom by assassination, would fight even harder for peace than he had on his mighty battlefields. Born on March 1st, 1922, he was a bookish, determined child who saw no destiny as a soldier.
He is a very well-educated individual, highly intelligent. He is a student in the School of Law in Bar Ilan University. He is also a scholar and a student of religious texts and a very strong believer in the sanctity of those texts. Only later on, as a result of the War of Independence, he was recruited into the military and finally has decided to become a professional soldier.
It was as Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army in 1967 that, with terrible irony, the future great peacemaker came to prominence as one of the greatest war makers ever. The armed forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan massed to fall upon the outnumbered Israelis. Rabin took the initiative by striking first with a daring early hours airstrike that caught the ready-to-fly enemy planes on the ground and destroyed 374 of them. After 3 days of fighting, the Egyptians were fleeing on all fronts, and Rabin had occupied the old city of Jerusalem. In just 6 days after it began, the war had ended. The enemy's armor and air forces were burning junk in the desert. Israeli borders moved outward. It had been a military miracle. On retirement from the army in 1968, Rabin became Israeli ambassador to the United States and deeply impressed high U.S. leaders. Returning to Israel in March 1973, he plunged wholeheartedly into politics. He was elected to the Knesset and entered Prime Minister Golda Meir's cabinet. When Meir resigned in 1974, he became Israel's first native-born prime minister. For 3 years, he was both dove and hawk, engineering a ceasefire with Syria, as well as the successful Entebbe raid to free Israeli hostages held in Uganda. Stepping down as prime minister in 1977 after his wife's violation of an Israeli banking law, he became defense minister in coalition government.
The Likud government did not heed the advice of Rabin and others and continued a very, very aggressive policy of settlement in the West Bank.
The Palestinian uprising in the territories, known as the Intifada, started in December of 1987. Yitzhak Rabin was the Secretary of Defense under Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. Rabin held from the beginning that Israel had to take a tough line toward the rebellious Palestinians and ordered the army to behave accordingly. However, within months after the beginning of the Intifada, he reached the conclusion that there was no military solution and made known his position to the government. On the opposition side, Jewish fundamentalists believed that under no circumstances could Israel possibly relinquish control of any part of its territory. When Rabin became prime minister for the second time in 1992, he boldly announced his goal of breaking long-hardened positions to achieve peace between Israelis and Arabs in general and with Palestinians in particular.
The meaning of that was essentially a territorial compromise over the West Bank and Gaza, or if you want to be even more specific, the returning of large parts of the West Bank and Gaza to the Palestinians. In the minds of some religious Israeli leaders as well as their followers, the return of this territory was defined as a religious sin.
Rabin froze new Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. and undertook secret negotiations with Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization. In 1993, Israel recognized the PLO and agreed to implement self-rule in the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
Immediately following these events, massive demonstrations and violent actions have started all over the land.
Death threats poured in, but Rabin always felt comfortable, protected, even in vocally hostile Jewish crowds. It never occurred to him that a fellow Jew might hurt him, and he refused to wear a protective vest among them. On the day of the assassination, Rabin was not well protected. He went to a massive rally in the center of Tel Aviv. There were thousands of people swarming around him. The important one was a 25-year-old right-wing extremist named Yigal Amir, who had studied Jewish texts for inspiration before deciding to assassinate Yitzhak Rabin at this peace rally, where Rabin had urged, "Sing only a song of peace."
Nobody asked him any questions, and when somebody did ask a question, he just said, "I am one of the drivers." The assassin approached him from the back and actually shot him from zero distance, point blank, 3 bullets to the back.
He would remark smugly that he didn't need to be any great marksman to kill Rabin from that distance. He thought God had helped him.
There are always people, I think, within any religious community that may give the interpretation that somehow God has allowed them and maybe even commanded them to commit an assassination. Throughout his trial, even though practically the entire state of Israel was against him, he stood his ground. He was constantly smiling in the courtroom. Among some young in Israel, he even became a hero after the trial and during the trial.
Whatever changes the assassinations of Yitzhak Rabin, Mahatma Gandhi, and Anwar Sadat had for the political world of the East, the changes for the prospects for peace were nothing but tragic.
Assassinations are always going to be part of the landscape. This is a part of the world where politics are felt acutely. They don't detach themselves. They don't work themselves up into a situation about a policy and then forget it all when someone leaves. If they're angry, they remain angry. If they're bitter, they remain embittered. And they won't forget if the person leaves that job or that spot. They'll track them down.
But can murder really intimidate the peacemakers? Will there be brave new voices, even though the assassins will surely hear?